So now we are playing the video now.
亚洲产业文化资产平台，也就是我们说的 ANIH， 是一个亚太地区的跨国产业文化资产平台。这个平台呢，是以多边的交流、还有资讯共享、还有跨域协作作为精神跟目标。我们希望来推动文化资产区域性和主题性的国际交流合作。长期以来呢，ANIH 我们盘点了亚洲产业文化资产的经典案例，还有名录。也梳理了亚洲产业文化资产的体系还有脉络，而这些学术资讯都可以在 ANIH 网站上看到。此外，还有这个半年期的这个期刊，提供专业的知识分享。每年度的这些论坛，我们也邀集了专家学者还有青年人齐聚一堂，大家共同来进行传承还有交流的活动，以及各式各样的讲座推广的这些活动也都在这里发生。平时大家也可以关注 ANIH 的一些 Facebook， 还有 IG， 还有 Twitter， 我们可以了解到全球产业文化资产的最新趋势还有讯息。大家都了解到，现在是一个数位的时代，每一个人呢都可以透过知识型的这个影片来做线上还有线下的自我学习。也因此呢 ，ANIH 的线上学习专区，我们希望用各种的影片，以有趣而且容易了解的方式开出亚洲各国不同文化资产领域的这些佼佼者，还有研究学者，他们多年的经验和成果，借由这些无远弗届的网络，把这些知识传播给更多的人，让大家更容易参与，而且乐于学习，让文化资产走进更多人的这个日常生活。我觉得。
5, 4, 3, 2, 1。没有声音。
各位线上的讲者，3位讲者以及这个在线上的这个朋友们，大家午安。那今天接下来是ANIH 亚洲产业文化资产平台所举办的一个一系列的演讲，今天来到一个有形跟无形对话的场次。
And today we're going to talk about tangible and
论坛开始之
intangible
前呢，
cultural
会先
heritage.
邀请局长
Before
以
we
这个影
start,
片的方
we
式
will
呢，
invite
来
our
跟大家打
director,
个招呼。
Director Chen,
接下来先
to
把时
give
间
us
交还给
a
这
talk.
个后台的主持。
Now,
老师，我们现在影片播完了，那您可以开始。对，
好，
可以开始 roll。嘿，
好的，好的，
好，
谢谢局长哦。那
thank you, Director
我
Chen.
收到这个ANIH来联系有这样的一个
When
这
ANIH
个
contact
论
me
坛活
about
动
this
的时候呢，我觉得非
seminar,
常非常的惊讶，
I
因
was
为在
very
过去这几
surprised
年ANIH 做的
because
事情
over
比
the
较
past
聚
few
焦
years,
在亚
ANIH
洲
has
的
been focused
产业
on
的文化遗产
Asia's
彼此之间的这
industrial
个对
and
话哦。那显
cultural
然这次注意
heritage.
到了一个有
And
形跟
this
无
time
形的这
they are
个议题
focusing
呢，是一个
on
非常
ICH,
非常有
which
创意
is
的一个这个
very
构想
innovative
哦。但
and
是
creative
我个人是
I
比较熟悉无
personally
形的领域，我觉得
is
这
more
个
familiar,
议题
personally more
呢，有
familiar
形无
with
形遗
the
产对话这个议
intangible
题非
cultural
常的有意
heritage.
思，也
So
是我
I'm
们
very
在无
interested
形
in
的
the
领域
dialogue.
里面呢，开始越
And
来越关注的一个议
I'm
题。我
also
先
very
稍
concerned with the
微的
ICH
回顾一
topics.
下无形文化遗
Let's
产
take
出
a
现
look
的那
on
个
the
情景
ICH
哦。
history.
在以这个 UNESCO 的这个
because
作为一
that
个最主要的基地来看的
UNESCO
话
is
呢，
the
是
main base.
2003年
So
正
in
式的
2003,
提出来了一个
they
非物质文化遗产
has
国
built
际
up
的互
the
惠公约
convention
这样的一
on
个
safeguarding the
国际
ICH.
公约。在那个时候，
This
在
international
UNESCO 已
convention
经处理的就是已
is
经
dealing
熟悉
with
的这个遗产的领
a
域
great
里面
deal
呢，
of
无形文化
world
遗产是一个
heritage,
新的成员。可是这个
and the
新的
ICH
成
is
员
a
呢，
new
好
rule
像是一个
in
革
the
命分子
convention.
一样，他提
And
出
it's
来了
like
与既有的文
a
化遗
brand
产
new
的概
idea
念、
to
价
the
值
world
或者是操
heritage.
作方式呢，
So
都
the
几乎是截
operation
然不同的一
is
个系
almost
统。
can say totally
无
different.
形文化遗产强调是
ICH
活的遗产，
emphasizes on
强
living
调 人
heritage,
作为一个
emphasizing
这个
on
遗产
people
的表现或
being
传
the
承最重要的
expression
媒介，
of
强调一
passing
个
over
未
the
来的取向。
heritage, and
这
also
跟有
emphasizing
形文化
on
遗
the
产
future
强调物
development,
件，
which is
强
different from
调
the
真实
emphasis on the
性， 强
object
调过
in world
去的
heritage
价值的深刻
and
的论
its
述呢，是截
history
然不
and
同的。
its past
那
significance.
但是
So
这
it's
几
totally
年慢
different.
慢的，大家
In
在学
recent
习认
years,
识无形文化
the
遗产，
public
以及
getting to
整
know
体社
the
会对于
ICH
怎么保护有形
and
文化遗
its
产的观
influence
念、
on the
经
culture
验
and the
的发酵
society.
之下呢，开始慢慢
So
觉得
we
这个
can see
原
that
来觉得是在搞革命
you can
的这个
see
新
realize
的
we can
遗产的
realize that
成员所
there's
提的
a
概
new
念，
member
似乎
enter
对
into
于
the
我
field
们整体
and
的来
it can
思考
actually
文化
help
遗
us
产
to
跟我
reflect
们当代社
on
会
the
的关
cultural
系呢，非常
heritage
的有帮
and
助。
its influence
那
on the
今天其实
current
就是在
culture
这样
and
的一个
society.
这个新
Therefore,
的遗产观念对
so
既有
with
的
this
遗
new
产观念的挑战
perspective
底下， 我
on
们
the
怎么
heritage,
更
how can we
包容的、更宽
be
广的
more
来思考两
inclusive,
者的关系所设
widely
计
to
的一场
uncover
论坛，
more
请来的3位
area of
的讲者
discussions.
呢，其实也都
So
他们各
for
自的经
our
验以及今
speakers of the
天要提
day,
出来
their
的这个案例的
experience
分享呢，都非常的
is
精彩。
very rich and
首先，我先来为大
very
家介绍
fruitful
3位的
for
讲者。
the
那
sharing.
第一位是
The first speaker
Alexandra Dennis，
is Alexander
请
Denise.
Sandra 跟大
Please
家
wave
打个招
to
呼。
our audience.
Sandra Dennis 呢，
Alexander Denise is currently is working is a senior worker in a research center which is located on island.
关注
The center is caring about ICH and the museum field work, as well as the relationship between power and the culture. Alexander is studying on the culture in Southeast Asia that has been living in Southeast Asia for over 15 years. So Alexander is going to share with us tangible and intangible culture from a brand new perspective, and how can these two fields to begin a dialogue. Today's conference we also invite another speaker is Tara Junadu. I'm sorry if I didn't say it right.
在
Tara
机构公
is working in a very special institution. It's a social enterprise. She founded the center. The name of it is focusing, the organization is focusing on the ethology and traditional arts. So it's carrying the culture and the society locally.
呢是
For their field, it's in Laos.
的这几年的活动，
Her work is focusing on how to help the ethnic minority to receive more attention and to be understood better through tourism or museum activities. So in a way, is to say, using the contemporary activities, they aim to activate the culture and society technique skills from the various races locally. Tara will also share with us their activity based on their museum. The museum is not the typical museum as we think it is. However, as a contemporary style museum, it offers a space showing that it is able to demonstrate and exhibit traditions in the existing space and facilitate communication between different people. And we have a third speaker. She is working from Hongja University as the chair of the Center of Austronesian and Cultural Sustainability. Professor Chen is a specialist on the Australasian studies. And today, she's going to share with us several different cases. First one is from Pingdong, Kadatibu tribes. She will be talking about the revival of Kadatibu and the slate houses from the regional experiences. She's going to look at the Wang'an old houses in Penghu. Wang'an Plaza is one of the most important sites in Taiwan. So she's going to share with us how can we utilize ICH perspective to think about the conservation of heritage, physical heritage. So we have speakers from Southeast Asia and Taiwan, and we will be sharing different examples from minorities. I believe we're going to have a full discussion and presentation. So I'll give the floor to our first speaker of the day, Alexander. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your introduction and thank you very much for the opportunity to come and share with you all in this webinar this afternoon. So let me begin by opening my presentation. As it was explained in the introduction a moment ago, we're going to be exploring the synergies between the World Heritage and Intangible Cultural Heritage conventions. And so what I'd like to do today is give you an overview of sort of comparative overview, very brief one, of both of these conventions. But I thought I would begin by first just showing you some images from Chiang Mai, Thailand, where I've been living for many years now. And these images demonstrate the synergies between intangible heritage and tangible heritage very clearly and vividly. On the left, you have it's called the Fontian folk dance. This dance is performed for many ritual and festival events throughout the year, and it demonstrates the unity and celebration of the city, but also paying respects to the spirit of the city and beliefs about the spirit of the city. And then on the right, we have Wat Jedi Luang, which is a 14th century Buddhist temple in Chiang Mai, a very important example of Chiang Mai's tangible heritage. And it's really considered the kind of center of the city, in the spirit of the city. So really just looking at these examples together to, at the very outset of this talk, demonstrate the kind of important synergies between living heritage and tangible heritage, because Chiang Mai would not be Chiang Mai without both of these aspects of its heritage. Okay, so in this presentation then, I'll be giving a bit of a comparative overview. It's short time, so I can't go into much detail, but I'll try my best in the time we have. And then we'll look at the key concepts in the ICH convention. And then we'll focus on some of the synergies between the conventions by looking at some examples from Southeast Asia. All right, so I think many of you are probably familiar with the World Heritage Convention to some extent, and you probably know that the roots of the World Heritage Convention are in this concept, this UNESCO concept of shared heritage. As the heritage of humanity. And if we look back in history, this really began in the 1960s. There were some international campaigns seeking to rescue heritage in danger. And these are the examples you see here from Egypt, from the monuments of Nubia that had to be moved. The entire monument had to be moved to another location to protect it from being submerged by Lake Nasser. So there was this idea that there is a collective responsibility, a shared responsibility for heritage protection. And this is something that needs to be done for the benefit of humanity as a whole. So it's a different conception. It's not nationalistically oriented. It's really about this idea of collective heritage of humanity, and there's a moral responsibility of protecting and preserving natural and cultural assets. So this was really the basis for the 1972 Convention of World Heritage. And of course, as we see, it focuses very much on the kind of built heritage, monuments, ancient sites. One of the key concepts for the World Heritage Convention is this idea of outstanding universal value. And this is rooted in these ideas of authenticity and integrity of the sites, integrity in terms of the form and design, the materials and substance, and also the use and function of the sites. So these are the basis for this concept of outstanding universal value. So World Heritage Sites, they're nominated by states parties, and expert bodies, the IUCN, ICOMOS, ICROM, play a key role in evaluating the nominations, but also the management and the reports following the listing of World Heritage Sites. So again, this emphasis on the materiality. But as of this year, there are 1,223 inscribed sites and 196 states parties, so very widely adopted in the global community. Now, if we look at the emergence of the 2003 convention, this is like 30 years after the World Heritage Convention. But in fact, there were efforts already in the 1970s by many member states to try to broaden the definition of heritage to also include living culture, including traditional knowledge and skills, rituals, oral traditions, performances, and social practices. So there were those efforts, but it really wasn't until the 1980s and 90s that we began to see some of the first instruments. The first of these was the recommendation on the safeguarding of traditional culture and folklore in 1989. But this instrument, unlike the World Heritage Convention, it was non-binding, so it wasn't widely adopted. Also, one problem was that it was seen as giving too much power to researchers, and also it was seen as problematic because it adopted this World Heritage idea of outstanding universal value for traditional culture. Which was seen as not appropriate and really not fitting for living heritage. So later in the 90s, we saw two more instruments, the Living Human Treasures program and the Proclamation of Masterpieces of the Oral and Intangible Heritage of 1998. These still had a kind of influence of the 1989 recommendation in that they introduced what we would say is hierarchies between practitioners. So Living Human Treasures identifies certain individuals who are seen as masters of their heritage practice or heritage knowledge. And then those others who may practice it are not acknowledged in the same way. So this is like a hierarchy between practitioners and also between elements. So again, these instruments were seen as having inherent problems, or that they didn't fit with the sort of spirit of living heritage, which is really, it belongs to a community. So it was agreed in the 1990s, there were many discussions and debates, and it was agreed that the approach to intangible cultural heritage needed to be more inclusive, it needed to be participatory, and it also needed to shift away from hierarchy and expert-based evaluations or studies, and instead be more community focused and centered on cultural rights. So this finally led to the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention, and this is a binding instrument. So states parties are expected to operationalize it and report on it. And it was entered into force in 2006. And it caught up quite quickly with the World Heritage Convention. There are now 183 states parties and a total of 730 elements worldwide that have been listed. So now let's look a little bit more closely at what the ICH Convention, I'll just call it ICH Convention, what the objectives are. Right away, Article 1 tells us that its purpose is safeguarding. And I say right away, what is safeguarding? It is not conservation. It is not this idea of maintaining the idea of authenticity that we have with the World Heritage Convention, but rather keeping alive, maintaining the vitality of living practices. So the terminology is very important. We move away from the ideas of conservation and towards this idea of safeguarding. Also, the convention tells us that the focus is on the respect for ICH of communities, groups, and individuals. So really centering on communities and their rights and respect for those communities and groups and individuals. Also, that the convention seeks to raise awareness and foster mutual appreciation among member states and communities around the world, and also to support international cooperation and assistance. Okay, so the actual definition, I think you are probably familiar with this, but that ICH refers to the practices, representations, expressions, knowledge, skills, as well as the instruments, objects, artifacts, and cultural spaces associated therewith, that communities, groups, and in some cases, individuals recognize as part of their cultural heritage, okay? So it is also including the material dimensions of living heritage. And very importantly, it's not what the nation state, it's not what experts or anthropologists recognize as heritage, it's what the communities themselves recognize as their heritage. Then the convention continues that this ICH is transmitted from generation to generation. It is constantly recreated by communities in response to their environment, their interaction with nature, and their history. and provides them with a sense of continuity and identity, promoting respect for diversity and human creativity. So this phrase, constantly recreated, again emphasizes that point that the ICH convention is not about freezing culture. It is about recognizing the dynamism and change and constant evolution, and yet the continuity of living practices and their importance to community's sense of identity over time. Okay, but it is important that the convention emphasizes that that UNESCO will only recognize that ICH that is compatible with existing human rights instruments, and also mutual respect among communities and of sustainable development. So those member states that seek to list an element of intangible culture on the representative list or urgent safeguarding list, there has to be it has to be determined whether they are aligned with the human rights instruments and respect and sustainable development. Okay. And ICH, the convention gives these 5 domains, but these are not exclusive. So it doesn't mean that these are the only domains. There can also be other areas. It can be sports or culinary traditions, or member states and communities can determine their own way of categorizing living heritage. But here we have the oral traditions and expressions, performing arts, social practices, rituals and festive events, knowledge and practices concerning nature and the universe, and then traditional craftsmanship. Okay, and we also have the 2 lists of the convention. We have the list of the intangible cultural heritage in need of urgent safeguarding. And this is geared towards developing measures for safeguarding those elements of ICH, forms of living heritage that are seen to be threatened, or that if there isn't a determined effort to safeguard, then they may disappear. These practices may disappear in the next generation because they are very threatened. And then the representative list is geared more towards visibility and awareness of what the convention calls viable intangible cultural heritage. That means intangible heritage that it's not necessarily threatened. It's alive, it's vital, but member states would like to raise awareness about ICH, that element, but also ICH in general, the importance of ICH through listing on this list. Okay, and just very briefly, that the obligations of states parties is to safeguard ICH on their territory, also ensuring community participation in identifying, defining, and managing ICH, drawing up inventories of the ICH in their territory, contributing to the ICH fund, and reporting to the committee. Okay, so let's now look in a comparative lens at these conventions, now that we've gotten a bit of an overview. So we know that for the World Heritage Convention, listing is the primary mechanism for conservation, right? So the conservation plans, everything is contained within a particular nomination dossier, and the listing of a World Heritage site, that is the mechanism for this convention. Now, if we look at the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention, it is in fact true, yes, there are lists, but the core objective is safeguarding of ICH regardless of their listing status. So in other words, the convention of ICH is not first and foremost about listing. Listing is one of the mechanisms, one of the tools for raising awareness and for safeguarding. But in fact, the ICH convention is much more inclusive and calls for support for really all ICH within a territory. So that is one key difference. Also, as we've seen, a key difference is that the World Heritage Convention does focus more on cultural and natural sites, landscapes, monuments, bioregions, whereas the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention focuses more on cultural and social practices. Also, we saw that the World Heritage Convention has this core concept of OUV, outstanding universal value. And again, the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention does not have OUV. There is no criteria of authenticity, only compatibility with mutual respect, human rights, and sustainable development. For the World Heritage, authenticity and integrity, these are concepts that help to define the value, and they are also intended to restrict certain changes, to the form, for instance, of certain architectural sites or archaeological sites, that they need to be restored in keeping with the integrity of the period in which they were nominated in terms of form and function and materials. But it is recognized that ICH, it changes over time. It can adapt new in many ways, including the sort of material inputs and components of living practices. So the focus is not on authenticity, but rather continuity. Also, World Heritage has a very prominent role for experts, these expert organizations, IUCN, ICOMOS, and ICROM. But for the ICH convention, really, first and foremost, it's the communities who define the value of their heritage, not experts. So these are some of the key differences. But let's look now, what are some of the synergies? Okay, we've seen the differences. What are some of the ways that the World Heritage and ICH Convention really support each other and are really, in fact, very interwoven? Well, for World Heritage, we've seen the focus is on conservation, but of course, World Heritage properties still have, they almost all have intangible meanings, practices, and values. And these can take the form of traditional indigenous knowledge associated with plants and animals in the case of natural landscapes. It can take the form of the traditional skills and knowledge associated with the restoration of architecture. It can take the form of ritual beliefs and oral traditions associated with World Heritage sites. There are many ways that intangible heritage is embedded in World Heritage. And for the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention, of course, it also has many tangible aspects. There are natural resources that are essential for handicrafts, rituals, and community livelihoods and lifeways. There are material objects associated with knowledge and beliefs and practices. There are texts, physical texts. There are ritual objects. When we talk about performances, of course, there are costumes and instruments and spaces of practice and performance. So these are all the material and physical dimensions of intangible cultural heritage. And we do also see this expressed in the conventions themselves and the operational directives. So for the World Heritage, if you're looking at the criteria for outstanding universal value, you see most clearly the focus on intangible values in criterion 3 and in criterion 6. So criterion 3 discusses to bear a unique or at least exceptional testimony to a cultural tradition or to a civilization which is living or which has disappeared. And criterion 6 refers to be directly or tangibly associated with events or living traditions, with ideas or with beliefs, with artistic and literary works of outstanding universal significance. Okay, and we have already read Article 2 of the ICH Convention, where we see the reference to the material dimensions of ICH in the very definition of what ICH is. Now, I should say that the ICH Convention was sort of the one that really put the community front and center and at the core of its principles from the start. And the role of community is found mentioned throughout the convention and the operational directives and the ethical principles. And the focus is on community rights and values and community participation. And in fact, the World Heritage strategic objectives later incorporated the role of the community. In 2007, there was an explicit incorporation of the role and rights of the community. So it is, slowly been, you could say, sort of catching up to the principles of ICH, because recognizing the rights and role of the community in defining and managing their heritage, including their at World Heritage sites. Okay, so that was a very quick discussion of the synergies, and let's just look at a few examples to kind of make this a little bit more concrete. So one I wanted to show you was of these the Ifugao rice terraces in the Cordillera in the Philippines. These terraces were listed as World Heritage in 1995. And actually one of the criterion was criterion 3, and that they were a testimony to the sustainable communal system of agricultural production. And, 1,000 generations of Ifugao peoples had been cultivating rice in this way and in this, fantastically sophisticated and beautiful system of rice terracing. So it was listed as World Heritage, but then also in 2008, these Hut chants, which are also belonging to the same Ifugao communities, these were listed as ICH on the representative list in 2008. And these Hut chants are very much central to the values and meaning and continuity of the Ifugao rice terraces, because in these chants, actually the Ifugao, they're a matrilineal kinship system, and it's primarily women who will sing these chants. They're performed during the sowing season of the rice sowing season, and the chants themselves are kind of narratives of heroes and ancestors and customary law, and they show this linkage to rice cultivation. So all of these traditional knowledge and beliefs that are transmitted while cultivating rice, which is a really remarkable relationship there. So you can see that this practice and this knowledge of the chanting is very much a part of the Ifugao rice terraces and their kind of continuity. And in fact, both now are facing threats of transmission of the knowledge of creating these terraces and also the chants themselves. So there are many safeguarding efforts to try to keep them, make sure they're transmitted to the next generation. Another example here on the bottom is the cultural landscape of Bali province, which is the Subak system, it's called, a manifestation of the Trihita Karana philosophy. This was listed as World Heritage in 2012. And this Subak system, it's again really extraordinary. These are water temples that are part of a system of managing the water supply for rice cultivation. And the landscape itself is considered sacred, and there are many rituals and practices of offering and artistic performances that are associated with these temples, with the water temples themselves. And so it is an integrated system of belief and also agricultural production. And as in the case of the Ifugao rice terraces, these were, the Subak system was listed as criterion 3 in the World Heritage OUV, in addition to others, but criterion 3 referring to the cultural traditions that shape the landscape of Bali. Okay, and then lastly, I just wanted to show you this example from Angkor Wat, which was listed in 1992, and Angkor in Cambodia, as I'm sure you know. And I think what's so striking about this this particular image of Vishnu is that it's very clear that this is a living site, that you have the Vishnu figure dressed in a robe, and there are offerings, and Angkor Wat, like many other listed temples or religious sites, has maintained its religious value and meaning and significance to the surrounding communities over hundreds and hundreds of years. So it is indeed a World Heritage Site, but very much a living site. And unfortunately now facing some very serious challenges about having to do with eviction, but we don't have time to get into that. But so this is just to give you some sense of those synergies. And now just to briefly touch on some of the tools and mechanisms for identifying ICH and World Heritage contexts. Okay, and really this is for any whether it's in a World Heritage Site or not, the starting point is really community-based inventorying. So providing and establishing a system of capacity building with members of the community so that they can be active participants in the inventory process of their living practices. That is the meaning of community-based inventorying. It's not only having a team of researchers or anthropologists or heritage experts going in, but really involving the community themselves in the practice of inventorying their heritage. And this is a starting point to identify threats and risks and the significance of living practices. And then, of course, the collaborative research and documentation, including capacity building for community members as well. So those are some of the key tools. And in closing, I just want to refer you, I strongly recommend that you look at this case study example from Georgetown, Penang. They have a lot of resources online. But just the approach that they took for community-based intangible cultural heritage inventorying in their World Heritage Site of Georgetown, Penang. And it really gives you a very detailed sense of how this organization involved the community in inventorying and what they did with the inventories and the whole dialogue process, because that is so important also for heritage, is really having that community level dialogue. Okay, I know I'm pretty much out of time, so I will just conclude by saying, as we've seen, ICH is living heritage. It's always changing. In World Heritage, there is authenticity, and OUV must be maintained through conservation. ICH focuses on the communities and who are the stewards of their heritage World Heritage does focus on communities, but it also has this role of experts in evaluating authenticity. Okay, so I will close there and we can follow up more in the time we have for discussion. Thank you.
谢谢Dennis 精彩的分享哦。Dennis 很清楚的说明了这个刚刚提到无形文化遗产是遗产世界里面的革命儿哦，那他更清楚的去做了这个他的观念主张的分析，然后最后呢，那个 Dennis 也提到说，其实这两者有形无形没有那么绝对的界限，有形当中也有一些无形的成分，无形当中也有有形的成分，更重要的是呢。他提出来了，不管是哪一种遗产，其实都跟他当代的相关联的社区有密切的关系。好，那我觉得 Dennis 的分享也提醒我们一点，遗产、文化遗产的世界呢，越来越多的类型，其实是表示一个我们对于过去的认知、过去的价值、过去的样态的认知呢，越来越宽广。这其实是一件好事，但是这么多的不同的文化遗产的类型并存
of heritage exist together, we should reflect like the culture is actually integrated, it's as a whole. We also have to look at it from a whole. And as a whole, we have to think about a variety of heritage conservation. Thank you, Dennis. The next speaker is Professor Chen. She will bring us back to Pingdong in Taiwan. Let's welcome Professor Chen.
好，谢谢主持人跟现场。
Thank you very much. I'm the only speaker sitting here and feel a bit lonely. However, I want to start with my case in Taitung, and the tribe is called Beinan. I work here for like over 20 years now. So I've seen them, how they refine their culture after the martial law was lifted. This process and the practice they do, we can evaluate how the ICH can lead us to different perspectives to look at the main role of each local communities. So there are three main points of today. The first is that after Taiwan's Cultural Heritage Preservation Act was amended, we can see there's greater emphasis placed on local communities. And the second point is like, as I mentioned, the Kadadibu case. Because of the act, they now have been protected. So how do they do it? And the third one, I am going to look at the registered cultural heritage settlements. There are two of them. And we are going to look at how they are revitalized through the management of civic organizations. I would like to quickly be going through this slide. In Taiwan, we have our own Preservation Act, and we are very largely influenced by the UNESCO's conservation in 2003. So we also look at the gap we have here. So after Taiwan's Preservation Act is amended in 2016, we redefined our classifications. And we also look at the physical environment and the social integration and to see how we can preserve it. We also look at the decentralization in the preservation process. Also, we want to have the community involved in the decision making. Thirdly is how can we take care of both the cultural value and also develop the economic value. So we need not just the governmental, but also civic organizations to come together. So it's integrated work. And I will give you 3 examples as showing case. And we will see like how can we build up a structure, a governance structure among local communities and the government. And for our process, the first is to build up the data. If it's in danger, then it will be listed down. And next, oh, I cannot see my slide here. So the next is to do the interview and the field work, and as well as educational activities. The 5 has to have the civil societies and local community to get involved. And to the left, it's the categories we have here. First, traditional performing arts, traditional crafts, oral tradition, folklore, traditional knowledge and practices. They are slightly different from the convention, the UNESCO's convention. So for my research, I work with the Aboriginal people to look at how can we revive the culture there. Let's think about it. If there's no such a preservation act to protect us, what kind going to happen to the local culture? Based on my observation, when it's not being taken care and the local people don't work together to practice such culture, then it will be influenced by modernization and the lifestyle will be changed. And with the Preservation Act, it's protection shell. It acts to, thank you very much for having to see my slide now. So if it's being impacted by contemporary force, the act can actually give protection. So I will give you the case of Kadadibu. This is the map. You can see where Kadadibu is located. For our Taiwanese audience, you may know where it is. It's a famous hot spring region. Taiwan. In 1987, the martial law was lifted. So a lot of regional and cultural activities were resumed. Thank you for helping me. Okay. Well, I was looking at their revival activities. In 1993, here in Kadadibu, they resumed the Malay Festival. But after the war, their lifestyle was largely impacted. So they actually don't go Malay, but regular rice. So over the past 50 to 60 years land, they didn't go any millet. So after the martial law was lifted, they resumed and start to grow millet again. So they also are inspired to rebuild the men's house. And a series of those actions bring up more activities and the ceremonies. Like in 96, they have the Monkey Festival. they also resume the co-op, the women's co-op groups. Now in 1998, they have a rainmaking festival. So in Taiwan, before the recent amendment, there was another amendment. With the help of the government, Kamadiban was able to list their Great Hunting Festival. And because the government officers were not very familiar with the cultural heritage, so the Aboriginal people were actually being excluded on the mountains when they carry on their festival. So the Privatization Act is actually a little bit conflicted with our Environmental Protection Act. So when they went to the court, the people were explaining that it's actually their part of tradition. It was the time people start to think the Aboriginal people's activities may actually conflict with other laws and regulations to protect the environment and the animals. Therefore, here today, the government started to come out a new regulation to co-manage the mountain area. So that's the case. We can see that how the Kadadibu people trying to resume their activities while facing all these conflicts from contemporary laws and regulations. So we can see such influence and interaction. Also, I also looking back the 30 year of the revival movement, I realized they have to divide their life in two tracks. One is contemporary one, they have the national holidays, and another one is the traditional seasons. So every year they have 8 major traditional festivities. So to carry on those festivities, they perhaps have to have a day off from their daily life jobs. So these are the current 8 major activities in Kadadibu. And this is their lifestyle. Because of the time strain, I'm going to just show you a few photos here. So starting from the end of the year, there is the Young Men's Monkey Festival and the Great Hunting Festival. So it is a time you hang out with the friends and family. And in March, they have to go to their origin space. That is where they landed Taiwan and to worship their ancestors. Next, because of the harvest season, so they will have the weeding festivities. Also, they train their young people, young men, how to hunt, how to live. And they also have male initiation ritual. Those are their spontaneous practice in their traditions. I have to say, they are trying to rebuild a fundamental for their culture, including the space arrangement. They need to find a space to create the men's house, and they also have to arrange their time and the schedule because they have a 2-track life. And the third one, I also see that they are being able to build up their own decision-making mechanism. So now, in addition to the existing ministers locally, they also have the decision makers. So they will work together to make decision for the area. So from the perspective of the tribe, we can see their lifestyle order has been transformed and rearranged. So I can see space, time, decision making, can tell how their current life are being impacted through the revival movement. Now let's look at another two cases. It's also very important heritage sites in Taiwan. They are both old houses. The first one is called Lao Qijia tribe, and another one is the Han settlement. Lao Qijia has preserved a lot of sled houses. There are nearly 50 sled houses. You can see the largest group of sled houses in Taiwan. Its shape of houses is so rare and not easy to see in Taiwan and very complete. In 1960, because of the water supply and the electricity, the kids have to go to school, so their lifestyle has changed. So only those who are doing the agriculture, those people will come back to the tribes. But on the other hand, because they are not here, so they have been preserved nicely. However, in Lao Qijia, there is a scholar. After he got his PhD, because his research is about Lao Qijia, so after he got his PhD, he came back and present his research and co-work with the Taiwan's Preservation Act. He is able to, in 2011, to set up an association. This heritage has collected a wealth of data. The person who present to the government saying that if we don't reserve the sled houses, it would be a shame. So he is encouraging people to come back and rebuild to maintain the house. So they also start to initiate tourist activities and arrange transportation. And they also prepare some traditional meals and housing so that tourists can experience living in sled houses.
So this is a picture from our visit last year. There will be a guide who actually begin guiding from below the mountain before we announce the mountain. And they will have a priestess to do a prayer first. That is a tradition because if they do not perform that, they are kind of casting a spell on us to protect us. Some of them, without this ritual, will actually feel out of fit after they mount the mountain. So they have gone through certain rituals to guide the tourist up to the mountain. So this is one of the picture of the slate house. They have brought back their traditional 5-year ceremony. This is the location where they hold that ceremony. As people are coming back to the village, they are able to fix those slate house that are out of shape. So this is the meal, the lunch that I had there. I brought the Kanadipo citizen to join the tour. Eventually, they have come up with more activities, such as teaching people to make traditional sacrifices. They even open up chances for people to make exchange here by living here or by helping them to gain a livelihood there, while the traditional or the tribal member teach these people to stack slates to build houses. And another example I have is the Wang'an Huazhai. Wang'an is a very historic settlement. Because of the people moving out, it is actually preserved quite well. But the houses there are very old and are collapsing. In the recent year, there are new creative travels agencies and some of the regional revitalization work group. The two of them work together to develop a creative tour or the cultural tour. They manage their own tours, they train their guides and bring in outsiders to learn more about the local story. In the early day, this area, in addition to trade, they're also working at fishing and agriculture. And you can see the beautiful floral tiles here because the people in the past generation made a lot of money. So these tiles are actually imported from Europe. And people feel very pity if these tiles or these buildings went to collapse. So we have a local researcher, Mr. Tsai. He had very profound research and understanding over the area. He actually did an inventory and research of the last name or the people's last name living in that area. And he had some of his publication as well. And the second part that consists this walking tours are managed by the workshop, the youth returning to their hometown. So these are very life-related experiences. For example, this fish furnace, previously, in the past, they didn't have any refrigerator, so they have this kind of processing facility to process the fish and to preserve the fish. And here's a picture of a elder teaching the tourists to make pickled cabbage. So also due to the lack of electricity or freezer, they need to pickle their crops. In this walking tour, the lunch is made by the local women who will also talk about how these food is processed. We will also invite a local elder to play the instrument that he made. And through the song that he sang, he sings the story of the people of the history there. So with the young people exploring and digging out the local story and turn them into a walking tour, a cultural tour, elder people can actually benefit as well. They can recover their social status because they become the person who can introduce the culture to others. So I believe that the cultural heritage practice is actually interwoven in the relationship between people, object, land, and practice. So we are able to make it sustainable, to make it develop continuously. If the society or the community can participate more or even dominate. As I mentioned, if the local community did not perform the cultural practice, then the protection mechanism, the acts, would not be of help. There should be a pioneer to start, to begin to preserve their practices. So for sustainable management or operation, the practice should be really interwoven with preservation and market mechanism as well. And that will end my presentation. Okay, thank you, Professor Chen. Professor Chen brought us back to the tribe, to the community, and help us understand the need of a community in terms of preserving or protecting their own heritage, and what's the meaning of the preservation forces from the government, and what is the meaning of cultural preservation in the community's perspective. So this will, and also how the society can help in terms of protecting these cultural heritage. And Professor Chen proposed that in order to support traditional culture, actually ICH and usual heritage are combined together by using the examples in Taitung and Penghu. She actually helped us see how academia and the civil society and the government are working together. They are not necessarily considered a traditional community as we understand, but these people or these external social forces is also paying attention or caring about the community. So they can use different way to contribute and to elaborate the efforts. I think this is very rewarding. And next, I will hand over the floor to Tara to talk about the cases in Laos. The floor.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and also to the two previous speakers who I think really set the stage very well for what I'm going to talk about. I will be sharing a bit more just experiences from my organization in Laos in really doing that, trying to create the link between tangible and intangible cultural heritage, specifically by empowering communities in this process. So first, to start, I will talk just a little bit about the cultural diversity of Laos, for those of you who may not be very familiar, and introduce my organization, and then go into our case study of the Voices of the Wind project, which was a project to highlight traditional music in Laos. And finally, just talk about some of the challenges, but the opportunities also of empowering communities in safeguarding of intangible cultural heritage. So first, Laos is one of the more ethnically diverse countries in Southeast Asia. It's a very small country, less than 10 million people, less than 8 million people, I should say. But there are officially 50 different ethnic groups that are recognized in Laos, though many researchers actually say there's somewhere closer to 200 different groups because of the different subgroups and languages. The Thai Lao, from where the country gets its name, only makes up 53% of the population. So that means that almost half the population is made up of all of these small different ethnic minority groups. It is in this context that we opened the Traditional Arts and Ethnology Center in 2007. So it was started by myself, Kun, as well as in a goal of promoting more understanding of the cultural diversity of the country. TAC really from the beginning wanted to focus on the belief in intangible cultural heritage as being promoted as part of our museum activities. And so this is what we have been working on since the very founding of our organization. So we do a number of different activities, which I'll show you. We do exhibitions promoting understanding of the cultural diversity of the country. And one of the things you'll see is that we very much integrate local stories, people's lifestyles, contemporary objects, as well as language and current life in the exhibition. So we're not a historical museum. And because we are an independent social enterprise, we started the collection, we started the museum ourselves. So all of the objects, all of the information in the exhibits were collected by ourselves or researchers that we work with directly. So we are primarily displaying more contemporary objects and telling the story of the living cultures of Laos today. We also continue to do research work in communities, both ourselves and also in conjunction with researchers or other organizations who work together with us and partner with us. We also have a school outreach team. So many young children in Laos don't have the opportunity to learn much about the cultural diversity of their own country. And so we both go into classrooms, but also bring students to the exhibits for them to learn more, for them to get excited, and to also have pride in their own cultural identity. And then finally, a large part of our work is our advocacy and livelihoods program. So the biggest part of this is that we work with handicraft producers from around the country, both primarily ethnic minority women, and we help them adapt their traditional handicrafts, their traditional textiles and crafts into more marketable sort of modern pieces. So for example, here we had worked with Aka and Oma women to create wine bottle bags from their leg wraps. So this is a leg wrap is a specific object that they traditionally wear, they traditionally sewed, but we help them to convert it into something different that could find a commercial market. And we work with these over 600 producers in 33 different villages and try to directly ourselves. And we try to help communicate the context of the crafts for the visitors to Laos or local people as well who buy those products. So really trying to help people understand the depth of knowledge, the skills, the intense time that it takes to create each of these products. And these are sold in our shops. Both we have one at our museum and we also have one on the main street of Luang. And these 50% of the income from these sales goes directly back to the artisans. So we're really trying to promote livelihoods based on traditional skills. So that's just a bit about our social enterprise and how we try to promote the celebration of cultural diversity in Laos and intangible cultural heritage. So you can see our mission here. I won't read it out in its entirety, but basically our goal is to support the ethnic communities themselves to safeguard their tangible and intangible cultural heritage for sustainable development. So you can see, though we are often classified as a museum, we don't really fit under the museum very, very neatly into the museum mold. However, that is somewhat changing. In 2022, ICOM adopted a new definition for museums. And you can see in this definition, it pivots somewhat to focus on intangible cultural heritage as well as tangible cultural heritage. And also you notice it mentions the participation of communities. So you can see that, like Dr. Dennis was mentioning, there is more of a focus now on intangible cultural heritage worldwide, a recognition from UNESCO, from other experts over the past 20 years or so, that intangible cultural heritage needs to be fully integrated in activities that, that all kinds of heritage institutions are engaged in. So I'm going to talk now just a little bit about this Voices of the Wind project as a case study for how communities can be engaged in safeguarding of ICH. So this project started in 2017, and the goal was to highlight the music and instruments of minority groups, to safeguard the tradition, the transmission of their knowledge, skills, and meaning, to celebrate the instruments, the makers, and musicians as well. And so we did a very large round of research, several rounds of research throughout the north of Laos, documenting traditional musical expressions. So we traveled through 4 provinces, went to 28 villages from 8 different ethnic groups, and conducted in-depth interviews. So we collected thousands of photos, videos, and audio recordings, and many of these actually featured the last musician or instrument maker of that area. And you know, one of the things that we really recognized is that simply by our team going to these communities and expressing interest and documenting these instrument makers and musicians, that increase the recognition and the interest from their own community as well. So you can see in some of these pictures that we took that a lot of times when we started asking musicians to play the instruments or show us how they made it, children and other people from the community would gather around as well to watch, to ask questions, to listen in. And there would be a lot of pride among these knowledge bearers in the skills that they had. That is perhaps not something that had been discussed very consciously in the past. With this information, we created an exhibition called the Voices of the Wind exhibition. It opened in September of 2018. And so it was quite a detailed, obviously we had a lot of information. So we tried to put in information about the role of music in rituals, how instruments are produced, the materials that are used, techniques for both making the instruments and playing the instruments, and the changes that a lot of these instruments are going through. Of course, because we were trying to show music, which is something that needs to be listened to and seen, we had over 200 videos and photographs on tablets that were in the exhibition so that people could really listen and watch the performance or making of these instruments. And the other thing we did is to invite musicians through the life of the exhibition to perform and share their stories linked with the exhibit. So you can see here we invited groups in as well as individuals. We showed them the exhibit, asked for their feedback on it. We held public performances free, and had children come in as well to see it performed. But of course, this was very much in a performative sort of presence in the museum. So what we also found was very important is that we wanted to ensure that there's dissemination, that there was giving back to the communities as well, and ensuring that they understood where it happened, what the skills were that they had, how they could be, how important they were. So we organized in the 8 villages that we worked in most consistently. We held sort of pop-up exhibitions and activities. So we went back to each of those villages. We created little exhibits with panels that you can see there on the bottom left of sort of rollout screens in Lao language. We put out instruments for people to try. We screened the videos that we had shot in those communities and other communities, and we also asked people to do small music performances. And we also printed these booklets, like you can see on the top left there, and we also provided DVDs and SD cards and photos back to the community, the musicians, the schools that were in the communities as well. So you can see there was a lot of excitement and interest when we would do these pop-up exhibitions, because it was quite exciting, I think, for these villages. People who were musicians might just start playing and giving an impromptu performance. And so kids were also gathering around and trying the instruments as well. We asked instrument makers or people who owned instruments to bring out their own if they were willing, and write a little label and create a little temporary exhibit of their own pieces that people could look at, try, touch, play around with in their own community. And there was a lot of interest in the book. A lot of the instrument makers we had worked with had never seen themselves in books like this before, so they found that fun. And also to see all of the other musicians and instrument makers we had worked with. So that was a way of kind of promoting some sharing and learning across communities. And so this really contributed, we found, to sort of a minor sort of revival in interest, excitement, and community spirit. So just having this pop-up exhibit, having these people perform, having objects out there was a way for people to really recognize how special this was to their community, in addition to the actual objects themselves. So I know I'm running out of time now, so just to close, I wanted to just mention some of the key challenges and the key issues that I think have been brought up by all 3 of the speakers today, including myself, that, until somewhat recently, most mainstream cultural heritage safeguarding work and organizations really focus much more on tangible heritage, built heritage, monuments, and national heritage priorities. And there's only now more of a recognition that actually intangible cultural heritage, non-hierarchical sort of systems for safeguarding and promoting cultural heritage need to be supported. But community-based intangible cultural heritage facilitation work is very time-consuming. It's more abstract, it's more complex. And for people, experts who have been trained in maybe more conventional heritage conservation or research or museum skills, may not have those kinds of skills in community facilitation. So there's somewhat of a gap in those skills, which I know UNESCO and other organizations is trying to address. But it is definitely also resource intensive to engage with community members in safeguarding intangible cultural heritage. So we really have to recognize the money and time that goes into it, and but we also recognize, as the last speaker said, that intangible cultural heritage safeguarding cannot happen without the communities themselves. Thank you.
好，谢谢Tara。如果我们从刚刚陈教授所提到的这个无形
She mentioned like the preservation, the need of to preserve ICH is not only require the identification of the tradition, it also require the outsiders, like the civic groups and the local community communicated to join. So from Tara's sharing, we can see that how like a social enterprise can get involved. So through Tara's sharing, we see that they are very treasure ICH preservation. Its root problem is that the owner itself has to be activated. Its energy for their tradition has to be activated. Therefore, it's impossible that without facing the community's motivation to preserve those heritage. So we need to understand the local community's problems and the needs to preserve those tradition and the heritage under the contemporary structure and regulations. For example, in order to activate the tribe culture, how can we explain to the public our culture? So it's a very important part. So for ICH, cannot be preserved from the old way. It has to find multiple different ways in order to express itself and to facilitate more discussion and give back to the communities to be more recognized by themselves in the tribe. So this is a very great case study and sharing. So that would be the end to our 3 speakers. Right now we have 4 questions. Maybe we can go through each of them and have our 3 speakers to answer. Well, for our 2 international speakers, Alexander and Tara, maybe can give us some short reply to these questions. So they want to know in Southeast Asia, when different communities or tribes, when they want to preserve their ICH, is it possible the way they want to do it is conflict with the convention rules? Is there any case about the potential conflicts? Do you have a case of it? Can you give an example? Maybe we can start with Alexander to give the answer, and the next Tara to answer the question. Thank you.
Well, yes, this is a very challenging and difficult question. And I think even though the World Heritage Convention does now recognize the role of communities and community rights, there are in fact quite a number of cases of conflict, not necessarily about local communities' living heritage practices, but just whether or not local communities are really recognized as key stakeholders in the management of World Heritage. So, I mean, just to give one example, that I showed you the picture of Angkor Wat, and so this is a very large and important World Heritage site. It has really become sort of a symbol of Cambodian national identity. But there have also been many communities who have lived in and around the Angkor Wat complex, even though, it went through a period of decline and it was never fully abandoned. There were always communities living in and around it and practicing their livelihoods. And in fact, in the World Heritage dossier, there is a recognition of these traditional communities. But because of the explosion of tourism, a lot of it, in fact, because of World Heritage listing, right? There has also been the expansion of many of these vendor stalls and some communities growing larger than the original traditional communities at Angkor Wat. And so, unfortunately, there was a recommendation from UNESCO to manage these expanding communities on the World Heritage Site because they were seen as a threat to the integrity of the site. And this became a kind of a green light for the Cambodian government to begin to expel and tear down many of the houses and vendors who were living in and around Angkor Wat. So it's actually quite a sad outcome in that case, because it's now considered a pretty serious violation of these communities' rights, and that UNESCO is seen as being complicit in this because there were also complaints about some of the structures that were being built by these communities. So I think this is an example where it's really crucial to have that dialogue and to recognize the rights of communities and to have a process in place that will listen to the concerns and needs of communities who are part of World Heritage sites. But unfortunately, the way things are structured in terms of management in many countries is that there's a very kind of top-down approach where, again, as in the case of Cambodia, unfortunately, there was just an order to, they actually did build some new communities outside of the Angkor Wat complex for these communities that were expelled, but it's really not livable at all. And so that is one example that comes to mind, but there are many others, and maybe Tara can add. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I think
谢谢 Alessandro. 那 Tara,
sorry, I was going to just say, I think Alex is more of the expert, I think, on the regional understanding of that, but it is true. I think there has been well documented that those conflicts can happen between communities and the more sort of state management of heritage sites. And so there is somewhat of a tension between the use of cultural sites for community needs. And I know in some cases here in Laos, there has been some questions about communities using certain temples for certain ceremonies that were seen as not being fully in line with heritage sort of conservation goals. But there is more and more now the recognition that if we need to support living cultural heritage, that there needs to be a balance, and that some impact on the built heritage may be necessary in order to meet the needs of the living cultural heritage. but there's no easy rules for how this happens, you know. And as Alex mentioned, and I think goes to the point that I said in my presentation, it really takes a lot of communication and community facilitation, ensuring that communities are part of the process of listing heritage sites and managing sites themselves. But that takes a lot of time and resources that a lot of times the management organizations do not have. So just adding.
好的，谢谢塔拉。那我们先跳到第3个问题哦。
We can first go to the third question and close by the second question. So the third question goes to Professor Chen. You talked about the dual track life in the Katadibo tribe. So they have their regular holidays and they also have their tribal holidays and ceremonies and rituals. So how can they get a balance, the way that they balance the ritual and the contemporary life? Is there a way that it can be applied to other tribes in Taiwan? What's your view?
Thank you, Dr. Huang.
小的错误，那个卡拉地布是在台
Katadibu is actually in Taidong. Yeah, it's close to Pingdong, but it's in Taidong. So actually a lot of other tribes are inquiring us about the experience in Katadibu. And for the Young Men's Association, they did share the experience in other tribes. However, each tribe, they have probably quite different conditions. And in some tribes, they actually being emerged throughout the colonial period. So for one tribe itself is actually already very diversified. So when our government think that this is one tribe, but we think one tribe, they actually regard themselves as different. So it has become a conflict within itself. So
办法复制哦，可是
So as we say that one tribe case cannot be copied to another tribe, it's a bit sad, but let me give a more positive comment and feedback here. I mean, whatever it takes, you just have to take the first step. Once it gets started, take Adatibu as example, we can see that it has been through quite a long period of time and have been through a lot of challenges. So Adatibu also receive a lot of outsider to help, like scholars, and they have foundations from the legal and the regulation fields. So throughout this period, the government's acts and regulations are gradually shaped and formed. So those challenges, actually, I think those experience of facing challenges can be copied and as a reference to other tribes. That would be my brief answer. Thank you. Thank you very much. So our fourth question goes to Tara. So this question mentioned that TAEC is a social enterprise. So when your first goals, when you first establish the organization, what's your goals and the visions? And when you're doing the field work and documentation works, during the process, I believe the data got to be massive. So when you are trying to sorting them out, what kind of challenges and difficulty did you face? And what kind of methods do you recommend to adopt? Also, the museum is like a media between the local communities and the government and the society. So is there any ways that we can go to that we see is consistent between them?
Thank you very much for the question. I think that to start, I can clarify also that my background is in community development and community facilitation. So I also came into founding TAC together with my co-founder. She actually has a museum background and a conservation background, but my background for the 15 years before had been in sustainable community development. And so I already had sort of the lens of looking at community needs when we started the social enterprise. So I think we were a bit lucky in that way that's why I was already thinking about intangible cultural heritage because of that background. But for sure, when working with communities, it is a challenge, making sure that we're communicating what we're doing, ensuring that they are part of the process, understand what we're doing and why, and feel comfortable with the process. So what, again, like I mentioned, it's more of an iterative sort of organic process of doing research. We're not necessarily going in with a clear objective of we're trying to find out such and such, and we're going to get those answers. And so we're just going to ask those questions. It's more of we are interested in a certain group of issues, perhaps, and we have conversations with people in the community, and we allow issues to emerge. So it's one that takes quite a bit of time and a lot of communication. Language is also important, ensuring we use local language, that we speak to people of all different sectors within a community. For us, that is also very important. We don't only speak to elders, or we don't only speak to the village leadership. We try to speak to young men and women, to artisans, to older women, to perhaps people one might not think as being cultural heritage bearers, but they can be. And so just through that process of conversations and discussions, it's easier to come up with thoughts that may have meaning for the community and for us to present and to address when it comes to heritage management. And sorry, your last question about sort of being a mediator with government and communities, we definitely see our role as being that, that we're the kind of organization that can sort of bridge the gap. As you might know, Laos is quite a small country. It's quite remote. Education levels are not very high in a lot of more remote areas. So the ability of some of these communities to really play a strong, active role in things like inventories or other safeguarding activities is challenging. So sometimes they need some assistance and people to advocate to remember their needs. So that's what we try to do on their behalf. Thank you. I hope that answered the question.
谢谢 Tara， 我想非常有智慧的一个回答。那么接下来有一题
feedback. Next, we have a question for Alessandra. This will be a quite comprehensive issue, but I believe this is a question that is much concerned by everyone in Taiwan. So if Taiwan wishes to register itself or to register some site to become ICH, how can we do that? To be more specific, how do we come up with the candidate list, and how can we expect that as we submit this kind of application?
文化遗产跟它的保护是有帮助的。
And by sending out this kind of application, how it will help us to shape or to raise the awareness of Taiwanese people on the ICH. This is very comprehensive, but I would like.
All right, thank you for the question. I will try to be brief since I know we're running out of time. Well, I will say that one of the, you can say it really is a kind of limitation or constraint of these UNESCO conventions is that they function and they operate in relation to member parties. So member states parties to the convention. And each state's party will have its own particular structure or system for how it will collect potential nomination dossiers of ICH and then present those to the ICH committee for consideration. So the first question then would be to look at what, where would Taiwan fit within that system of developing a dossier, developing a nomination. I don't know if you've probably had a chance to look at the nomination files. They're updated and changed a bit every year. And once that nomination develops, is written, where does it go within the system that Taiwan is in? That would be the first issue to address. It's really the sort of structural and bureaucratic dimension of this convention because it works with member states and states parties, right? I mean, but otherwise, I can say, I want to give the example of Scotland because, they have, they're of course part of the UK, but have undertaken their own community-based, they've developed a wiki-based inventory. And many other countries have done this as well, but Scotland's is interesting for comparison with Taiwan because they've decided, we have our own distinctive ICH and we want our own inventory for it. And so they invite community members from all over Scotland to contribute entries of ICH, living heritage, to this online inventory. So it's a kind of an online repository. It's open to the public. And there are several other really good ones like that. Finland also has a really wonderful online inventory that operates similarly. So it's certainly possible to do a kind of inventory of ICH and hold to the community-based principles and do that for Taiwan and have a, perhaps a web-based resource to raise awareness, and it can then also be a tool for education, for communities and schools and to learn more about Taiwan's ICH. So my recommendation would be to explore that kind of possibility. Mm-hmm. Thanks, Tara, for
谢谢 Alexandra 一个非常有启发的建议跟案例。
Thank you, Alessandra, for your recommendation. We have already run over time, but in this short period of time, we've already have very great exchanges on the topic of ICH. So on behalf of the Annie, I will close the webinar, and I will invite the speaker to turn on your camera to take a photo.
谢谢 Alexandra。
Thank you to Alessandra, thank you to Tara, and thank you to Professor Chen. I enjoy today's talk very, very much. Thank you.